In 1976, the FBI received a letter. Attached 15 hairs and a piece of skin, collected from a forest in the Pacific Northwest by a well-known researcher after 2 U.S. Forest Service biologists had spotted something tall, something they couldn't identify. 43 years later, the FBI declassified its findings. The evidence was real, the investigation was real, and then it disappeared from the public record for nearly half a century. This is what happened on the Olympic Peninsula. Andrew here for Permanent Underclass, where we explore the weird stuff your therapist would tell you to avoid. The "oh cool, now I'll never sleep again" side of reality. If you're easily scared, easily offended, or easily anything, you're in the wrong place. Part 1 ended with a question. We told you about the Olympic Peninsula. We told you that federal officials investigated something out there. We told you it disappeared. No explanation, no public statement, just gone, erased. Today we're going back to find out why. The Olympic Peninsula is not a normal forest. It sits in the upper left corner of Washington state. A sprawl of old growth, temperate rainforest so dense that daylight barely reaches the forest floor. Moss hangs from every tree like something is suffocating them. The air is always wet, cold, the kind of place where sound dies, where you can scream and nobody hears you. Miles and miles of it, barely mapped, barely explored, the kind of wilderness where something could hunt undisturbed for centuries. The indigenous tribes that have lived there, the Kawaki, the Silakan, others, they don't call it Bigfoot. They call it Dzoonakwa. The other tribe, and their stories aren't cute, they're not folklore meant to entertain children around a fire. The tribes describe something that watches, that studies humans, that occasionally decides humans don't belong in certain places. Some accounts describe it as cannibalistic, as territorial in ways that suggest intelligence, predatory intelligence, not animal, something worse. By the 1970s, the sightings on the peninsula had become impossible to ignore. But these weren't blurry photos or campfire stories whispered by drunks. These were official sightings, wildlife experts, federal employees, people trained to identify animals seeing something that broke every rule of biology they understood, and then reporting it through official channels. That's when the government got involved. That's when the documentation stopped. That's when people started forgetting what they'd seen or stopped talking about it. Because something on the Olympic Peninsula doesn't want to be found, and the people who came close to proving it were convinced to stay silent. It started with 2 men in the forest. Both were employees of the U.S. Forest Service. Both were trained biologists. Both knew what animals looked like when they moved through the trees. And both saw something that morning that didn't match anything in their training. The location was remote, dense forest, the kind of place on the peninsula where trails disappear and old growth closes in. According to reports that would later surface, the creature was standing upright, bipedal, watching them. Not aggressive, not yet, just watching. Like it was curious about what they were doing in its territory. One of the biologists managed to approach closer. He found something pressed into the bark of a nearby tree. Caught there, snagged as the creature had squeezed through an impossibly tight gap between 2 massive trunks, something that didn't belong. Hair, dark, coarse, attached to a small piece of skin. He collected it carefully, bagged it, documented it, because this was real. This was evidence. Within days, a well-known researcher, a man who had dedicated his life to documenting the creature, was contacted. He arrived at the site. He examined the forest. He looked at what had been collected, and he made a decision that would haunt him for 4 decades. He sent the evidence to the FBI. Not a cryptozoologist organization, not a university, to federal law enforcement, because what they'd found was too significant to ignore. In the 1976, Peter Byrne, director of the Bigfoot Information Center, wrote to the FBI's Scientific and Technical Service Division. His letter was careful, professional. He explained that his organization had collected physical evidence, 15 hairs attached to skin, and they were unable to identify it. He asked if the FBI would analyze it. He asked for a comparative analysis. He asked plainly if the FBI had ever examined hair that might belong to a Bigfoot. The FBI said yes, they would examine it. In the interest of research and scientific inquiry, they would make an exception. They would test the samples. Months passed. The testing continued in FBI laboratories. And then, in February of 1976, the FBI completed its analysis. The hairs were of deer family origin. That was the official conclusion. Deer. Nothing more. Case closed. But here's what happened next. The letter containing those results was sent to a third party. Not directly to Byrne. It arrived at an intermediary. Someone was supposed to pass it along, and the letter got lost in the mail. Or it was delayed, or it never arrived at all. Byrne never received it. For 43 years, Byrne believed the FBI had ignored his request. He believed they'd taken his evidence and simply never responded. He believed the government had buried it. And he was half right. The FBI tested it. The FBI had responded. But the response was classified, filed away, not declassified until 2019, more than 4 decades later, when the FBI released its records and Byrne finally learned the truth. The government had investigated, found nothing, and kept it quiet. Why would they do that? Why would a federal agency spend resources testing hair samples from a creature it didn't believe existed? Why classify the results? Why keep the files sealed for nearly half a century? Unless they found something they didn't want the public to know about. Unless the answer wasn't deer hair. Unless they actually found terrified them. By 2008, a man named Derek Randles decided to do what the government wouldn't. He was a landscape contractor, a wilderness guide, a man who'd seen something in Olympic National Park back in 1985 that changed how he moved through the forest forever. He knew the peninsula. He knew the terrain. And he knew that if proof existed anywhere, it would be out there in the deep woods where almost nobody ventured. Randles assembled a team, researchers, biologists, trackers, people with credentials. People who took this seriously. Together, they formed the Olympic Project. Their mission was simple: document the existence of Sasquatch through science. No drama, no hoaxes, just evidence. They started deploying cameras in 2009, motion-triggered, high-end, positioned on ridgetops and saddles, where the creature would naturally cross. Within months, they had 50 cameras in the forest, 50 eyes watching the wilderness day and night. The footage came back grainy, low resolution, mostly deer, mostly elk, but occasionally, something else. Thermal imaging captured a large bipedal figure moving through dense forest. The proportions were wrong for any known animal. Too tall, too broad. The gait was humanoid, but not human. It moved with an intelligence that suggested it understood it was being watched. And then it would disappear into the trees. But the cameras revealed something else. Something that made the researchers question whether they were actually investigating the creature or whether the creature was investigating them. Researchers began finding the cameras deliberately repositioned. Not knocked down, not damaged, repositioned. Turned around on the trees, facing away from the forest, facing towards where the researchers stood, as if something had figured out what the cameras were for, as if it understood the technology, as if it was sending a message. One investigator, a former deputy sheriff named Rich Germeau, had his own experience with this. He set up cameras on his property to document game trails, high-end equipment, motion triggered, state-of-the-art. He came back days later to check the footage. He found all of them turned around, every single one, all facing inward, towards the cabin, towards where humans lived. He collected the memory cards anyway, reviewed the footage. The night cameras were moved. There was no footage of the creature moving them. The cameras simply recorded the forest, empty, silent, and then, in the span of a single frame, one frame, the camera's angle had shifted. The forest was there, then it wasn't. Then it was pointing backwards. No motion blur, no struggle, no sign of how it happened. Just a creature intelligent enough to understand human technology, intelligent enough to disable it without leaving evidence of the act. Germeau collected DNA samples from the area where the cameras had been. Hair, skin cells, biological material that had something left behind deliberately or carelessly. He sent them for analysis, expecting to see results matching known species. The lab came back confused. The DNA was novel. It didn't match anything in the database. Not human, not ape, not bear, not any mammal cataloged in North America. The samples matched each other perfectly. They came from the same species, but that species didn't officially exist. Germeau wasn't alone in collecting this evidence. The Olympic project had been doing the same thing for years, accumulating samples, running tests, getting back results that said, unknown, unknown, unknown. But the real discovery, the one that changed everything, came from deep in the forest, far from any trail, in terrain so hostile that even experienced hikers reported feeling watched, hunted. One timber surveyor, working alone in the deep woods, stumbled upon something that shouldn't exist. Structures. Built structures, dozens of them, clustered together in a clearing that seemed chosen specifically for its isolation. The surveyor radioed it in immediately. His voice on the radio was wrong, strained. He described what he was seeing but wouldn't elaborate. He just kept saying they needed to see it. They needed to understand what was building these things. When Randalls arrived with the team, they found more than 20 nests, all within close proximity, built from woven branches and sticks, intricately constructed, each one 8 feet long and 4 feet wide. The weaving was identical across all of them. The same technique, the same hand, the same mind directing the work. What struck the researchers was most wasn't the intelligence required to build them. It was the purpose. The nests weren't shelters in any conventional sense. They were built in places that made no survival sense. High up in trees, where a fall would be fatal. In terrain so difficult that humans could barely navigate it. In locations that suggested the builder wasn't trying to be comfortable. It was trying to be invisible. Biologists examined these structures. Forest Service personnel examined it. Everyone reached the same conclusion. These required opposable thumbs, manual dexterity, planning, intelligence. No known animal in North America could build these. The only creature that is human. Or something close enough to human that the distinction didn't matter. Randall's team began monitoring the sites obsessively. Long-term cameras, regular patrols, documentation of everything. And they started noticing something that made their skin crawl. The creature, or creatures, understood the surveillance. When human activity increased near the nest sites, the nests would be abandoned. The structures would be left to decay. The new nests would appear miles away, deep in the forest, further from human contact. It was learning. It was adapting to their presence. It was staying ahead of them. By 2018, the evidence had accumulated into something undeniable. Thermal footage of a bipedal figure moving through the forest with humanoid gait and intelligence. DNA that matched nothing in existence. Physical structures that defied conventional zoology. Decades of credible witness accounts. Patterns of behavior suggesting not just intelligence but self-awareness. They had everything except one thing: a body, a specimen, proof that would force the scientific community to acknowledge what lived in the Olympic Peninsula. But they also had something else. They had made something uncomfortable. Quietly at first, funding for certain research lines would dry up. Access to certain forest areas became restricted without explanation. Permits that had been approved suddenly required reevaluation. Questions asked to researchers would go unanswered. Phone calls would go unreturned. The inference was subtle, professional, deniable, but it was there, and it was familiar. It was the same pattern that had occurred in 1976 investigation. Discovery, then the slow, methodical silencing of everyone involved. Rich Germeau wasn't a believer looking for proof. He was a trained investigator, a former deputy sheriff, a detective, a man whose job was to assess threats and separate fact from fiction. He'd spent decades in the Olympic Peninsula woods as a hunter and a fisherman without ever reporting anything unusual. He was skeptical by profession and nature. Then in 1985, alone in the forest, everything changed. He saw something that the official channels told him couldn't exist. He described it as massive, not 7 feet taller, moving through the trees with a speed and grace that shouldn't be possible for something that size. Moving like it owned the forest, like it knew every root, every branch, every way to move without making sound. He reported it officially. And then he learned what happened when you tell the truth about the wrong thing. People stopped believing him. Colleagues dismissed it. The Forest Service took his statement and filed it away. So he kept quiet. He lived with what he'd seen. And then he moved through the woods differently after that. Always aware, always watching. Always feeling like he was the hunted, not the hunter. Then, in November of 2010, he had a second encounter. This time on Harston Island, miles south of the main peninsula. He was with a group checking trail cameras. They'd been receiving reports of strange noises in the area. Howls, vocalizations that didn't match any known animal. Germeau volunteered to check the cameras alone. He was bent over working on one of the units when he heard it. Not a growl, not a roar, an exhale, a breathing sound. Close, so close he could have reached out and touched it, whatever it made it. He looked up. It was standing next to a tree, 20 yards away, massive. 7 feet didn't cover it. The shoulders were too broad, the frame too dense, the presence too overwhelming. It was watching him, not curious, not defensive, studying him, the way a predator studies prey before deciding whether to strike. Germeau froze. Every instinct told him to run. Every instinct told him this was wrong. This wasn't an animal. Animals don't study humans like that. Animals don't have the intelligence in their eyes. This was something aware, something that understood exactly what it was looking at. The creature bent its knees, a deliberate movement, not panicked. Then it moved. Germeau's words, "It does it in one motion. 0 to 45 miles per hour in 0 seconds, across the clearing, impossibly fast, impossibly coordinated. And then it was gone, into the brush, into the forest, and Germeau was alone again. His hands were shaking. His training meant nothing. His skepticism meant nothing. He'd just come face to face with something in the world that said doesn't exist. And now he had to live with that knowledge. He collected DNA samples from the area where he had stood. Hair, skin cells, biological material left behind or deliberately deposited. He sent them to be analyzed. The results came back marked. Novel. The DNA matched nothing in the database. Nothing in North America, nothing in the world. It was a species that officially didn't exist. Germeau tried to report it through official channels, law enforcement, wildlife agencies, federal authorities. The response was always the same. Professional silence. Polite dismissal. Probably a misidentification. Likely a bear in unusual lighting. Have you considered the stress of working alone in remote areas? They were gaslighting him. A trained detective, a man with 2 decades of law enforcement experience. They were telling him his eyes were lying. That his training meant nothing. That what he'd experienced, what he could prove with DNA evidence was impossible. Because if it was possible, then everything they'd built their careers on understanding about North America's wildlife was wrong. And that was unacceptable. So they buried it. They ignored him. They made sure that when Germeau spoke about what he'd seen, people looked at him differently. Like he was unstable, like the forest had done something to his mind, like a man who'd spent his entire career in law enforcement suddenly couldn't tell the difference between reality and a hallucination. Germeau stopped talking about it publicly. He kept investigating quietly, on his own time, because he knew what he'd seen, and he knew that nobody in power wanted to know. But the Olympic Peninsula's secret wasn't new. It wasn't discovered in 1976 or 2008. The indigenous tribes that have lived there for thousands of years, the Kawaki and the Slakam, the Micah, others, they've known about it for centuries. They have a name for it, Dzoonakwa. The tribes don't speak about it casually. It's not a story meant for entertainment. It's knowledge passed through generations with a specific warning attached. Seawood is a member of the Kawakiawaka First Nation. He spent over 40 years investigating Sasquatch reports across the Olympic Peninsula. He's considered one of North America's leading Sasquatch specialists. And he'll tell you plainly, what lives in those forests is not what mainstream science thinks it is. According to tribal accounts, Dzoonakwa is intelligent. It's territorial. It watches humans. It studies them. Sometimes it decides that humans don't belong in certain places. The accounts describe it as an apex predator, but not in the way bears or wolves are apex predators. Dzoonakwa hunts with intelligence, with strategy, with an understanding of human behavior that suggests it's observed us for a very long time. Some tribal stories describe encounters that end in violence, in disappearance, in people who went into the forest and never came back. Not because they got lost, not because they had an accident, but because Dzoonakwa decided they were a threat, or an intrusion, or simply in the way. The tribes describe it as occasionally cannibalistic, not out of necessity, not out of starvation, but as a deliberate choice, as a statement, as a way of marking territory, as a warning to other humans, you don't belong here, and if you keep coming back, there will be consequences. This knowledge, this understanding of what actually lives on the Olympic Peninsula has been documented for centuries. It's embedded in tribal art, in stories, in the names of places that outlanders don't understand. The tribe knows what's there. They've always known, and they've always been careful about what they were, about where they go, about when they go, about whether they go at all. But the federal government doesn't listen to indigenous knowledge. Scientists dismiss it as folklore, mythology, superstition. And so the investigation continued. The cameras kept rolling, the DNA kept coming back as unknown, and the creature kept staying ahead of everyone trying to document it. Because it understood the threat better than anyone. It understood that if it was proven to exist, the territory would be invaded, its habitat would be destroyed, its species would be hunted or studied or dissected or displayed. So it stayed hidden, it stayed intelligent, and it stays one step ahead. And the people who got too close to the truth, the researchers, the investigators, the witnesses like Germeau, they started experiencing professional consequences. Funding dried up, access was restricted, questions went unanswered. The same pattern over and over. Investigation, discovery, silence. If this kind of content keeps you up at night, do me a favor, like and subscribe. If you want more of this, follow us on TikTok and Instagram at Permanent Underclass and on X at The Underclasser. We post stuff there that doesn't always make it to YouTube. By now, the pattern is undeniable. 1976, the FBI tested hair samples, found something they couldn't identify, classified it, buried it for 43 years. 2008 through 2018, the Olympic project deployed cutting-edge research, found thermal footage, found DNA that matched nothing, found physical structures that defied zoology. And then access became restricted. Funding dried up. Official channels stopped responding. Rich Germeau reported 2 enormous encounters, supported by DNA evidence. Law enforcement dismissed him. The scientific community ignored him. He was gaslit into silence. The indigenous tribes have documented this creature for thousands of years. Their knowledge is dismissed as mythology. Their warnings are ignored. Their territory is encroached upon by researchers and hunters who don't understand what they're walking into. Why would the federal government work so hard to keep this quiet? Why would they actively suppress research that could lead to the discovery of a new species? Why would they silence witnesses? Why would they restrict access to areas where evidence is being found? These are only a few possible answers. Either the creature is so dangerous that the government has decided the public can't handle the truth. Either the creature's existence would force a complete restructuring of North American wildlife management and land protection. Or there's something about the creature, something about its intelligence, its behavior, its relationship to humans that terrifies the people in power so much they'd rather keep it a secret than acknowledge its existence. Or, and this is the question that keeps researchers awake at night, or the government knows something about this creature that goes beyond simple zoology, something that would change how we understand not just wildlife, but human history itself. The Olympic Peninsula remains one of the most documented yet most secretive regions in North America. Hundreds of sightings, dozens of credible witnesses, physical evidence that defies explanation, DNA that shouldn't exist, structures that require intelligence to build, and yet the official record says nothing. The scientific community acknowledges nothing. The government investigates nothing, at least not publicly. Derek Randalls and the Olympic project continue their work. Quietly, without major funding, without official support, they document what they find and they watch as the same institutional forces that buried the FBI file in 1976 work to suppress their discoveries today. Rich Germeau moved away from the peninsula. He still investigates, still collects evidence, still tries to get people to listen. But mostly, he's learned that every witness learns. The truth about the Olympic Peninsula is something most people aren't ready to hear. The indigenous tribes continue living in the knowledge their ancestors passed down. They know what's out there. They know what to avoid. And they watch as outsiders keep walking into the forest, looking for proof of something that's been watching them the entire time. Because Dzoonakwa doesn't need to be discovered. It's been here longer than any of us. It understands this land better than we ever will. And it's made it very clear some forests are not for human exploration. Some territories are not for human research. Some mysteries are meant to stay buried. But we can't help ourselves. We keep looking. We keep investigating. We keep pushing deeper into the wilderness, convinced that we can find proof, convinced that we can make people believe, convinced that the truth will win over silence. And every time we get close, the same thing happens. The funding stops, the access ends, the questions go unanswered. The witnesses are discredited, the evidence disappears. Because there are people, powerful people, who understand something about what lives on the Olympic Peninsula that the rest of us don't. And they've decided we're better off not knowing. Next, we go into the Cascade Mountains, 1994. A man with a camera, a family of creatures moving through old-growth forests in broad daylight. Footage that was seen by wildlife experts, footage that changed everything, and footage that vanished. No copies, no distribution, no public record. Just gone. What was on that film? Why was it suppressed? And what happened to the man who shot it? Part 3 up next.